They arrived on a Tuesday morning, their vessels gleaming like polished obsidian against Earth's blue atmosphere. The Zeltheri collective had crossed 17 light-years to deliver their ultimatum, and they did so with the casual arrogance of a species that had never known defeat. Their diplomatic envoy descended in Geneva, for figures emerging from their craft with movements so fluid and graceful they seemed to dance rather than walk. Ambassador Kale-9 stood before the assembled nations with what we would later recognize as contempt, though at the time we mistook it for mere alien stoicism. His species had conquered 47 worlds, he explained through the translation matrix hovering before him. They had subdued civilizations that could manipulate quantum fields with thought alone, had broken empires that wielded the power of dying stars. And now they had come for Earth, not because we posed any threat, but because the collective's expansion demanded it. We had one rotation of our planet to surrender unconditionally, or face consequences our primitive minds could scarcely comprehend. What the Zeltheri didn't understand, what none of the civilizations in their conquered territories could have warned them about even if they'd tried, was that humanity had evolved in a prison we called home. Every species they'd encountered had developed on worlds with forgiving physics, planets where gravity pressed down with the gentleness of a mother's hand. The average Zeltheri homeworld exerted roughly 0.6 standard gravities. Their bodies had evolved tall and elegant, their bones light as honeycomb, their muscles designed for efficiency rather than raw power. They moved through their cities like living poetry, and they assumed such grace was the natural state of intelligent beings. They looked at humanity with our compact frames, our dense musculature, our heavy bones built to withstand forces that would shatter their own skeletons, and they saw weakness. They saw a species that had barely crawled beyond their own moon, that squabbled among themselves over invisible lines on maps, that had only recently learned to split the atom while the collective had been folding space for millennia. They saw primitives. They saw prey. Secretary General Morrison stood before Ambassador Kale-9 in that first meeting, his weathered face grave but unbowed. The weight of 8 billion souls pressed upon his shoulders as surely as Earth's gravity pressed upon his feet, and he chose his words with the precision of a surgeon. We would not surrender, he said quietly. We had fought too long and too hard for our fragile peace, had climbed from caves to cities through countless generations of struggle and sacrifice. If the Zeltheri wanted Earth, they would have to take it from humanity's cold, dead hands. Kale-9's response was a sound the translation matrix rendered as laughter, though it held no warmth, no genuine mirth. He gestured to the holographic display hovering before the assembly, showing vast fleets of warships, weapons that could boil oceans, technology so advanced it would appear as magic to our eyes. And what would we fight with, he asked mockingly. Our chemical rockets? Our crude nuclear weapons? Did we truly believe our primitive militaries could stand against the might of the collective? Morrison's jaw tightened, and something flickered in his eyes that the ambassador failed to recognize. It was the same look that had burned in the eyes of soldiers at Thermopylae, of defenders on the walls of Vienna, of pilots climbing into cockpits knowing they might never return. It was the look of a species that had forged itself in fire and emerged stronger for it. We would fight with everything we had, Morrison replied. And when that failed, we would fight with our bare hands if necessary. The ambassador dismissed this as the empty posturing of a doomed species and departed, giving us our 24 hours to contemplate our annihilation. The Zeltheri expected chaos. They expected panic in the streets, governments collapsing under the weight of imminent extinction, perhaps even infighting among human factions desperate to secure their own survival by betraying their fellows. Instead, they witnessed something their databases had no reference for, something their artificial intelligences struggled to categorize. Humanity unified. Within 6 hours of the ultimatum, old enemies were sharing intelligence, pooling resources, coordinating defensive strategies. Russia and America, China and India, Israel and Palestine, nations that had spent decades or even centuries at odds with one another suddenly remembered that they were all, first and foremost, human. The change was neither smooth nor simple. Generations of mistrust don't evaporate in an instant, even in the face of alien invasion. Arguments erupted in emergency sessions of the United Nations. Accusations flew. Old wounds reopened and bled anew. But beneath the acrimony, beneath the political posturing and wounded pride, a current of determination ran deeper than any ocean. Earth's greatest military minds gathered in bunkers and war rooms across the planet, poring over every scrap of data they'd collected from the Zelthari vessels. The news was universally grim. Their ship's hull composition was unlike anything in our material sciences. Their energy shields could deflect directed energy weapons with casual efficiency. Their faster-than-light drives bent space itself, making them effectively untouchable by conventional missiles. Every simulation, every strategic model, every tactical analysis arrived at the same conclusion. In a straight fight, humanity would last approximately 4 hours before total annihilation. General Sarah Chen sat in her office at Pacific Command, staring at the data streams flooding across her screens, and refused to accept defeat. She had spent 30 years studying warfare, from ancient battles fought with bronze and wool to modern conflicts waged with drones and cyber weapons. She understood a fundamental truth that the Zelthari, in their technological superiority, had forgotten. War was not merely about weapons or shields or the ability to destroy. War was about finding your enemy's weakness and exploiting it with ruthless efficiency. And every enemy had a weakness. The Zelthari had made a critical error in their arrogance. They had shown themselves to us. We had watched their diplomats move through our world, had observed their reactions, their physical tells, the subtle ways their bodies responded to Earth's environment. And we had noticed something they themselves seemed unaware of. They struggled here. It was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. The way Ambassador Kale9 had gripped the podium during his speech, not for emphasis but for support. The slight tremor in his limbs after standing for more than a few minutes. The way their delegation had requested chairs, something their own recordings showed they rarely used on their vessels where artificial gravity could be adjusted at will. They were suffering under one standard gravity, and they had come to conquer a species that had evolved in it, had been shaped by it, had spent every moment of every generation since the first fish dragged itself onto land fighting against its relentless pull. Chen began making calls. To research facilities studying the alien physiology. To space agencies that had decades of experience with the effects of gravity on living organisms. To sports medicine experts who understood human biomechanics in extreme conditions. A picture emerged that transformed despair into something far more dangerous. Hope. The Zelthari skeleton was approximately 60% less dense than human bone. Their muscle tissue, while efficient for their environment, generated roughly half the force of equivalent human musculature. Their cardiovascular system, evolved to pump blood in low gravity, was struggling to maintain adequate circulation against Earth's pull. Every moment they spent in our gravity was exhausting them, straining their bodies in ways they'd never experienced. And we, the primitive humans they'd come to conquer, walked through that same crushing force as easily as breathing. We were born in it. Molded by it. Our ancestors had carried it on their backs as they hunted across savannas, climbed mountains, built civilizations stone by stone. One standard gravity wasn't our enemy. It was our home field advantage. The plan that emerged from that realization was audacious to the point of madness. The Zelthari expected us to fight them in space, or at range with our primitive weapons. Instead, we would invite them down to Earth. We would draw them into close combat, into environments where their technology meant nothing and raw physical capability meant everything. We would turn our prison into their tomb. The response from Earth came exactly 24 hours after the ultimatum, broadcast on every frequency the Zelthari could receive. Secretary General Morrison appeared on screens across the planet and presumably aboard their vessels, his expression carved from granite. Humanity rejected the collective's demands. We would not surrender our world, our freedom, or our future. If the Zelthari wanted Earth, they were welcome to come and take it. The invasion began at dawn. Zelthari assault craft descended through the atmosphere like falling stars, targeting major population centers on every continent. Their strategy was textbook orbital superiority doctrine. Seize key locations, demonstrate overwhelming force, break the enemy's will to resist. They had done it 47 times before. They expected this to be number 48. The first ships landed in Shanghai, their deployment ramps lowering to reveal squads of Zelthari shock troops in powered armor that enhanced their strength and protected them from our weapons. They advanced into the city expecting to find terrified civilians and token military resistance. Instead, they found empty streets and an eerie silence. Then the buildings began to collapse. Not randomly, but strategically, tons of concrete and steel falling into carefully calculated patterns that channeled the alien forces into kill zones. The Zelthari pressed forward, their armor protecting them from the debris, their confidence unshaken. They rounded a corner into what had once been a major intersection and found themselves facing the People's Liberation Army's 3rd Special Operations Group. The engagement lasted 7 minutes. The Zelthari troops, despite their advanced armor and energy weapons, found themselves in a nightmare. Their weapons were deadly, yes, but they required accuracy, and the human soldiers moved through the rubble with the grace of predators in their natural habitat. When the aliens tried to give chase, to press their advantage, they discovered that their armor, designed for efficiency in low-gravity environments, was suddenly a burden. Each step was harder than the last. Their targeting systems struggled to track humans who could leap and roll and climb with fluid ease while they labored under the crushing weight of Earth's gravity. And when the fighting went hand to hand, when Chinese special forces closed to grappling range where energy weapons became useless, the Zelthari learned a horrible truth. Without their armor, they were fragile. A human punch, backed by muscles that had evolved to function in one standard gravity, could shatter their delicate bones. A tackle that would have been routine in training became lethal when executed on a being whose skeleton was designed for a gentler world. The after-action reports from Shanghai were almost identical to those from London, Sao Paulo, Lagos, and Sydney. The Zelthari were losing ground combat operations. Badly. Ambassador Kale-9, observing from his flagship in orbit, struggled to comprehend what he was witnessing. The humans were supposed to be primitive, weak, their military forces laughably inferior. Yet his troops were reporting casualties at rates that should have been impossible. Squads of shock troops, veterans of dozens of planetary assaults, were being overwhelmed by beings who should have posed no threat. He dispatched his elite units, the Void Claws, warriors who had never known defeat. They landed in the Australian outback, where intelligence suggested a key military command center. What they found instead was the Special Air Service Regiment, and a lesson in why humanity had dominated its planet despite having no natural weapons, no armor, no venom or claws. The battle took place in 40 degrees Celsius heat, under the brutal sun of the outback. The Zelthari Void Claws, already struggling with gravity they found oppressive, discovered that their thermal regulation systems, perfect for climate-controlled vessels and temperate planets, were failing in Earth's extremes. They overheated. They slowed. And the SAS operators, humans who had trained in these conditions until they could operate in them for days without pause, pressed their advantage with merciless efficiency. By sunset, the Void Claws had been annihilated. Not defeated. Not forced to retreat. Annihilated. Kale-9 received the news in his command center and felt something he had not experienced in his long career. Fear. These humans, these primitives who should have been easy prey, were winning. Not through superior technology or numbers, but through simple, brutal physical superiority in the environment they called home. The gravity that had forged them into the compact, powerful beings they were was crushing his warriors like insects. He made the call to escalate. If they could not win on the ground, they would bombard from orbit. They would burn the planet's surface until nothing lived, and claim the lifeless rock for the collective. It was a failure of mission objectives, but better than the alternative. Better than admitting that the Zelthari collective had finally met a species they could not conquer. The order to commence orbital bombardment went out across the Zelfari fleet, and for a moment, it seemed humanity's defiance would end in nuclear fire from the heavens. Energy weapons capable of boiling lakes and leveling cities began charging their capacitors. Targeting solutions were calculated for every major population center. The collective would make an example of Earth, a warning to any other primitive species that might consider resistance. Then the first railgun round struck the flagship's aft section at a significant fraction of light speed. The Zelfari had detected Earth's railgun installations, of course. They had classified them as primitive kinetic weapons, easily countered by energy shields designed to deflect particle beams and plasma weapons. What they hadn't accounted for was simple Newtonian physics applied with human stubbornness. The round was solid tungsten, shaped and calculated with precision that would have made ancient engineers weep. It didn't have guidance systems or warheads or any of the sophisticated technology the Zelfari expected. It was just mass and velocity, and when it struck the flagship's shields, it didn't try to burn through or explode. It simply transferred its kinetic energy. The shield generators overloaded instantly. The round continued through the hull, through 3 decks, through the secondary reactor chamber, and out the other side. Emergency klaxons screamed through the flagship as atmosphere vented into space. More rounds followed, launched from installations hidden across Earth's surface, each one targeting a different vessel with calculations that had been refined in seconds by humanity's networked computing systems. The Zelfari fleet scattered, breaking formation to evade the kinetic barrage. Their ships were faster, more maneuverable, but they had to constantly adjust their trajectories, burning fuel and energy that had been meant for the bombardment. And while they dodged, Earth's space agencies launched their secret weapons. Not missiles. Not warships. Satellites. Hundreds of them. Small, cheap, equipped with minimal maneuvering thrusters and a single purpose. They spread through the orbital space around Earth like a swarm, each one nothing more than a hunk of metal and basic electronics. Individually, they posed no threat. But there were so many of them, and they moved with coordinated precision, boxing in the Zelfari vessels, forcing them into narrower and narrower corridors of safe passage. The alien fleet found itself in a tactical nightmare. They couldn't bombard the surface without exposing themselves to the railguns. They couldn't advance without risking collision with the satellite swarm. And they couldn't retreat without admitting defeat. Kale-9 made the decision to commit his ground forces completely. If they could seize the railgun installations, eliminate Earth's ability to threaten the fleet, the bombardment could proceed. He deployed every soldier, every vehicle, every piece of military hardware the collective had brought to this backwater world. They would overwhelm humanity through sheer numbers if necessary. The ground war that followed would be studied for generations, assuming there were survivors to study it. The Zelfari threw everything they had at humanity's defensive positions. Energy weapons carved through fortifications. Armored vehicles that could shrug off anti-tank rounds advanced through withering fire. And still, they couldn't break through. In the Himalayas, Indian mountain troops who had trained at altitudes where the air was thin enough to kill ambushed Zelfari columns struggling to breathe in what humans considered normal atmosphere. In the Amazon, Brazilian special forces who had learned to move through jungle as silently as jaguars hunted alien patrols that couldn't distinguish safe ground from sucking mud. In the Arctic, Norwegian soldiers who could operate in temperatures that would freeze Zelfari blood solid picked off isolated units with methodical precision. The pattern repeated across every continent, in every climate, in every type of terrain Earth had to offer. The Zelfari were fighting an entire planet that was hostile to their very biology, and the natives, the humans they had dismissed as weak, were thriving in conditions that would kill the aliens in hours. General Chen watched the tactical displays from Pacific Command and allowed herself the smallest of smiles. They were winning. Not easily, not without terrible cost, but winning nonetheless. Every Zelfari soldier sent to Earth's surface was one more warrior pulled out of their element, forced to fight at a disadvantage they couldn't overcome with technology or training. And with every hour that passed, they grew weaker. Muscle fatigue set in as their bodies struggled against gravity they weren't built for. Circulation problems developed, causing cognitive impairment. The psychological stress of operating in an environment where every movement required twice the effort they were accustomed to began to break their morale. Meanwhile, humanity fought with the desperate fury of a species defending its only home. Soldiers who had been enemies months before now fought back to back. Resources were shared freely. Intelligence flowed across borders without hesitation. Old grudges were set aside because survival demanded it. The Zeltheri had expected to conquer a divided world. Instead, they had unified humanity in a way nothing else ever could. The turning point came on the 5th day of fighting, in what would later be called the Battle of Mount Kilimanjaro. The Zeltheri had concentrated their remaining ground forces for a final push toward one of Earth's primary railgun installations. They came with everything they had left: heavy armor, air support from their remaining atmospheric craft, and the last of their elite units. Waiting for them were elements from 23 different nations, unified command structure hastily assembled but functioning with surprising efficiency. The battle began at dawn, with the Zeltheri advancing up the mountain slopes in a massive column. Earth's defenders opened fire from elevated positions, raining down everything from conventional artillery to improvised explosives. The aliens pressed forward, their armor protecting them, their weapons devastating the defensive positions. It should have been a rout. The Zeltheri had superior firepower, better protection, more advanced technology in every measurable way. But they were climbing a mountain in full combat gear, in gravity that was slowly crushing them, at an altitude where the air was thin enough to make humans breathless and was suffocating to species evolved on low-gravity worlds. By the time they reached the midpoint of the mountain, the Zeltheri advance had slowed to a crawl. Soldiers collapsed from exhaustion. Officers struggled to maintain command as hypoxia clouded their judgment. The powered armor that should have been an advantage became a prison, the servomotors straining to move limbs that felt like they weighed tons. That's when humanity counterattacked. Kenyan mountain troops, Ethiopian special forces, Nepalese Gurkhas, soldiers from nations that had spent generations in high-altitude environments, descended on the struggling aliens like an avalanche. No heavy weapons, no artillery support. Just humans with combat knives and the kind of close-quarters fighting that required nothing more than strength, speed, and the will to survive. The Zeltheri broke. For the first time in their history of conquest, the collective's forces routed in full retreat, abandoning equipment and wounded in their desperate scramble to escape back down the mountain. Many didn't make it. The gravity they had dismissed as irrelevant, the simple physics of Earth's mass and the acceleration it imposed on everything, killed them more surely than any human weapon could have. In orbit, Ambassador Kale-9 received the reports and knew the invasion had failed. He had lost 60% of his ground forces. His fleet was trapped in an orbital space that had become a cage. And the humans, the primitive humans he had threatened with annihilation, were pressing their advantage with the grim determination of apex predators defending their territory. The communication came directly from Secretary General Morrison, transmitted on an open channel that the entire collective fleet could receive. Humanity was offering terms. The Zeltheri would leave Earth's system immediately and permanently. In return, we would allow them to depart with their surviving forces intact. Refuse, and we would continue this war until every last alien invader was dead or captured. Morrison's voice was calm, almost gentle, as he delivered what amounted to humanity's final ultimatum. He explained that we understood the Zeltheri had come here believing they were superior, that conquest would be simple, that we were nothing more than primitives waiting to be subjugated. We harbor no hatred for that assumption, Morrison said. But you must understand what you attempted here. You came to a world where gravity is a constant burden, where the environment itself can kill in 1,000 different ways, where survival has required adaptability and resilience beyond what your species has ever needed. You looked at humanity and saw weakness, but what you actually saw was compression. We are a species that has been squeezed and hammered and forged under pressures your kind have never experienced. You saw our compact frames and heavy bones as primitive, not understanding that every aspect of our biology has been optimized for war against our own planet. Kale 9 sat in his command chair, listening to the human's words, and felt the weight of his failure crushing down on him with the same inexorable force as Earth's gravity. Everything Morrison said was true. The collective had mistaken humanity's appearance for weakness, had assumed that technology alone determined military capability. They had forgotten the fundamental lesson of biology: environment shapes evolution, and evolution shapes capability. Humans had evolved as pursuit predators on a high-gravity world with extreme climate variation. They could run for hours without stopping, could function in heat that would kill most species, could survive cold that would freeze Zeltheri blood solid. They healed from injuries that would be fatal to more delicate species, could consume foods that were toxic to others, could even, their research showed, survive radiation exposure that would kill collective citizens in minutes. They weren't weak. They were terrifyingly, almost impossibly resilient. And the collective had declared war on them in their own environment. The decision was made. The Zeltheri fleet began its withdrawal from Earth's system, leaving behind thousands of dead and the shattered remnants of their invasion force. As they departed, every ship's crew watched their sensors, seeing Earth recede into the distance. That small blue world, unremarkable in so many ways, had done what no other planet in the collective's history of conquest had managed. It had defeated them not through superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but through simple, brutal physical superiority in its native environment. In the years that followed, the story of Earth's resistance spread through the galaxy. The Zeltheri collective quietly struck humanity from their list of targets and issued warnings to their member species. Earth was to be left alone. Humanity, it turned out, was far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Not because of our weapons or our technology, both of which remained primitive by galactic standards. But because we had been forged in a crucible that most spacefaring species had never experienced. We were the children of a high-gravity world, adapted to conditions that would kill softer species, and we carried that adaptation in every cell of our bodies. The galaxy had learned a lesson it would not soon forget. Gravity, that most fundamental of forces, wasn't just a physics problem to be solved with technology. It was a forge that shaped species, that determined capability, that separated the prey from the predators. And humanity, for all our flaws and divisions and primitive technology, were apex predators born of a world that showed no mercy to the weak. The Zeltheri had thought humans were weak right up until the moment they felt Earth's gravity crushing down on them like the weight of judgment itself. They came to conquer, and instead they learned humility. They came with arrogance, and left with respect. They came believing they were the hunters, and discovered, too late, that they were merely prey that had wandered into a predator's den. Earth remained unconquered, her children unbowed, and the stars themselves took note. Humanity had announced its presence to the galaxy not with a plea for mercy or a request for acceptance, but with a simple declaration that would echo through the void for generations to come. We are here. We are strong. And this is our world.